good morning, good afternoon once more, everyone, and welcome to the third module on ethics. So we are starting with ethic dilemmas in medical research. We will talk about the global, African, and Cameroon stories here. So the outline will be as follows. We will present the global cases, the African context, the Cameroon specific cases, and the lesson learned for a call for action. This presentation is to highlight historical and global cases, ethical violations, and also the aftermath. Specifically, to present the historical and contemporary cases of ethical violations in medical research, and to emphasize on the importance of ethical principles such as informed consent, justice, equity, and other ethical considerations that we will see. So you should first of all note that medical research is a cornerstone of scientific progress, and this progress has saved millions of lives. However, this progress came with a significant ethical cost. So throughout history, researchers have crossed many moral and even physical boundaries, exploiting vulnerable people and prioritizing scientific curiosity over human autonomy, human dignity, human rights. So this presentation is made where we will explore these global, African, and Cameroon specific cases of the ethical dilemmas in medical research. Before looking at ethical dilemmas, these are the ethical considerations where we'll mostly be talking about voluntary participation, right to withdraw with no consequences that has been added, informed consent, anonymity, privacy and transparency in reporting, non-maleficence, beneficence, dignity, autonomy, and human rights. You can see that the one highlighted here are principles from the Belmont's report. Normally, there are three: justice and equity, dignity, autonomy, and human rights, and also non-maleficence combined with beneficence. So you are doing good and you are reducing the bad that can happen to the participant. Now, if we are looking at ethical dilemmas in the world, what happened? We can start with the Nazi medical experiment, where false experimentations by those soldiers were done to prisoners and other group of vulnerable people. They were doing like freezing, poisoning, sterilization, infection, other ways, so as to study how disease progression and how the medical curiosity was really high in this context. Here in this picture, you can see you can already see how they were judged because it was really bad. It is the first experiment reported. The ethical violations here were on voluntary participation, whether you wanted or not, you were to participate if you were chosen. So you're even chosen without your own consent. That is why informed consent comes here. Human rights were not respected. Non-maleficence, that is not doing bad, was not respected. Justice and equity, and there are much more. So the aftermath, which is what came after, was the Nuremberg Code. So the first international ethics guideline. Imagine that something was this bad for the Nuremberg Code to come in place in 1947 after this Nazi medical experiment. We also have the Tuskegee syphilis study, where Black men were denied treatment for syphilis just for them to study disease progression even after cure penicillin was discovered later on. Imagine that one of the first problems here was why only recruiting Black men in your study? Secondly, the treatment is there, but you don't want to cure them because you still want to see the first, second, third stages of syphilis progression. So it was really like very bad. Imagine it was so bad that the lesson learned on the aftermath was the Belmont report. After the father of different ethical codes, which is the Nuremberg Code, we now have the Belmont report. The ethical violations here were on deception, the informed consent. It was not totally full. It was not. They were not completely aware of what was happening to them. Just that they wanted to study a particular diseases. Harmed marginalized groups. These marginalized groups are the vulnerable people. Beneficence was not respected. It was not doing good to the people. Equity, human dignity wasn't respected. So you can see that after the study, syphilis study, the Belmont report was made. We also have the Guatemala syphilis, again coming with syphilis, now out of the US, where researchers intentionally, so it's not as if they was studying something and it came later on. No, it was done intentionally, infecting prisoners, soldiers, and psychiatric patients. You can see here that these are vulnerable. What is vulnerability? It is when you don't have sufficient means to say no to something that has to be to a particular study. You can be vulnerable economically, financially. That is, we promise you something so that you can participate. You can be vulnerable according to your own physical condition. You can be vulnerable to your mental condition. So these psychiatric patients are vulnerable. Prisoners are vulnerable because they want to have something after participation. So, but when you are completely full of all your different functions, you are not, or there's a less like risk of vulnerability. They cannot promise you, okay, I'll give you this for you to participate. So you are less likely to be vulnerable to a particular study. So this was violating informed consent, because you cannot just say to someone, I'll infect you and he will accept. So it means that those participating are not fully aware of the study. The beneficiary, you were not doing good to them. You were instead deliberately doing harm. So non-maleficent was not even respected. Voluntary participation, when there's always a psychiatric patient or vulnerable participant, it's not more voluntary. And the aftermath was this 2010 US apology to the Guatemalans and the strengthening the protection of vulnerable participants. This thing of vulnerable, you see coming again in many studies, that has made it to be put in almost all the ethical convention in the world. Vulnerable participants have to be protected. After that, we have the Wilbro hepatitis study. So after syphilis, now when they went to study hepatitis this time, and they intentionally again use mentally disabled children infected with hepatitis to study disease transmission, disease progression in this Wilbro State School. So you already see vulnerable people again in the studies. So before in the in the early 1990s, it was really using them was really easy because they had no major right to refuse, because you needed something. If parents of these mentally disabled children, if you want your child to be taken care of in our state school, bring him to the study. We just want to study hepatitis and see how it is going on. It's not much harm or something. Since you are really poor and your child is first of all mentally disabled, okay, let me accept just for this for science. But now they don't they infecting intentionally someone that is really poor. You have learned, yeah, scientific curiosity. This is how the diseases is transmitted from one person to another. This is its life cycle. But what about the children who came first of all to be treated mentally? So it was not finally their main objective. Coercion is what you see, and they were forced. Parents were forced to enroll for admission. You had no money, so we can even pay your admission. Just give us your child, and we will take care of him. Harm to children. First of all, they are children. They are vulnerable. Secondly, they are mentally disabled. Second level. Thirdly, the parents were not having sufficient money. So you see that it was difficult for them to refuse. Harm to children, voluntary participation, equity. Equity, because why only choosing mentally disabled? Equity in the Belmont report should be equity and justice. You should give a scientific reason of your population, of your study population, of your eligibility criteria. That is why all your theses, all your different reports you are doing should always have this population eligibility criteria. Why them and not those? So the aftermath here was still the strengthening the protection on vulnerable. Imagine that they are still doing this. Meanwhile, the Belmont report and the Nuremberg Code are still there. You see that it was not really emphasizing on particular aspects on vulnerable populations protection. You can also have this psychological aspect of the Stanford prison experiment, where a psychologist wanted to show that people are bad or people are good according to the role they are given. So he met in his class a prison where some students were to be policemen and others were to be prisoners. It was a psychological study to evaluate the prison dynamics. Are prisoners bad because they are, or because they have been given the role, the etiquette of prisoners? So participants started abusing roles. They had powers, especially a policeman. Wow, you are just from school, they give you the full power. The psychology gave the full power to do whatever you want to the prisoners because he wanted to see if you are given full power, will you change your way of acting? Meanwhile, you are friends with someone, the person is the prisoner, you are now the policeman. What will you do? Will you still be compassionate or will you use that power? But unfortunately, the participant abused their role of policemen and started abusing the different prisoners. So it gave psychological harm and the lack of ethics oversight too, because it didn't pass through rigorous ethics review. So here, the strengthening ethics in the psychological research and institutional review boards. Now there is this aspect of any psychology study should also pass through institutional review boards for further studies. So you have seen here that we have looked at non-maleficence, beneficence, dignity, equity, and all other ethical considerations that were violated due to these different studies in the world. Now, what about in Africa? What happened? What were the different ethical dilemmas that we could have? We have this one that needs to be talked about much more. The Tchatchouang trial in Nigeria, where during a meningitis outbreak, the big pharmaceutical company Pfizer tested Trovan, which is an antibiotic, on 200 children, where 11 died and others were disabled. You already know what happens on clinical trial, the different phases. A drug should not, or anything that has to be tested should not just come out like that. But this outbreak makes things to run as fast as possible. So there was improper informed consent on all the risk of having this vaccination, the non-maleficence because you were not really controlling, reducing the harm, the equity, only targeting particular children from particular country, and voluntary participation. So the Nigeria government sued Pfizer in 2009, and and it was compensated with the $75 million settlement in 2011. And later on, the National Health Research Ethics Committee, which is the Nigerian's National Ethics Committee, was established to regulate clinical trials. After that, we also had these Novozyme trials in multiple sub-Saharan African countries. So it was really proven that Zidovudine permits to reduce mother-to-child transmission. But those who did the study were like, it is proven outside. Let's just try again here. So they separated two groups, randomized. There was the placebo control where no treatment was received from them. So you have HIV and they don't give you a treatment so that you are trying just to observe if finally zidovudine also could also have a good efficacy on mother-to-child transmission to test its efficacy. But it is already proven, many clinical trials showed that, but it was not sufficient for those scientists. They wanted to show again in sub-Saharan Africa if it is really functional. Okay, there's no problem. But now, why not giving something to the placebo control? No treatment completely. Meanwhile, there's already something proven. It means that you are first of all denying effective treatment to placebo, making children to be born with HIV, especially in low-income countries. Informed consent wasn't improper informed consent. Beneficence and equity were not respected. It was so much that the aftermath of it was the 2000 Declaration of Helsinki revision. So there was already the Declaration of Helsinki. They had to revise it again due to this kind of trials. Prohibition of placebo use if effective treatment exists. That is why now in many clinical trials, the placebo is not more an ineffective treatment. If there's already something that exists, you will use that thing and you compare it to a new drug to test either non-inferiority or superiority of the drug. No treatment in placebo control group because you are exposing them. Meanwhile, the treatment is already available. After that, we have the seroquel trial in South Africa, where they wanted the scientists, the researchers wanted to test the efficacy of seroquel, which is an antipsychotic, on homeless individual. You imagine it's why not individual but homeless for off first of all for on homeless individuals. So they are already vulnerable. They don't have a house. You have to promise them something. And in ethical violation, you will see coercion here. And secondly, for off-label uses. Off-label uses is from something, seroquel is antipsychotic, so it is confirmed, it has passed all the phases and it is made for it. But now you are like, okay, let me test on other things like anxiety, depression, but you haven't tried it for a clinical trial. First of all, you want to directly test the efficacy on homeless individuals. So the off-label uses were not yet tested and approved. So there's the correction. We have improper information, informed consent, beneficent, non-maleficent, and voluntary participation. As soon as you are always seeing coercion, which is forcing an individual by promising something, you'll see voluntary participation. It's not more voluntary. You already put something on the table. If you will have this, you don't have a house, so let's try our drug. There are not much consequences. We will take care of you financially and all. So this aftermath of this was the strengthening of vulnerable people protection and highlighting corporate exploitation in low income, because what happens in Africa is that most of the trials done were not by Africans coming from outside and testing whatever the efficacy of whatever they wanted, especially on vulnerable populations. We also have the male circumcision of trial in the 2000 in Kenya and Uganda and other countries, where it studies promoting circumcision to reduce HIV risk face a backlash over consent and cultural sensitivity. This study were published. It is normal. Male circumcision reduces. The French came through INRS. They saw it was good, and Anglo-Saxon also companies came to study this, and it was proven. But the problem is, what about the cultural sensitivity? What did you promise to those people? They are not used to circumcision. So participants misled about full HIV protection. So when they were discussing, when the scientists or the researchers were coming for male circumcisions, they were giving higher expectations. It is reducing infection. It is not fully protecting you against HIV. But most of them didn't understand it, making some of the men, when they were circumcised, they were already used to do anything because they thought, I am fully protected, I am circumcised. Meanwhile, it was not the real objective. Inadequate follow-up for the people who had complications and cultural sensitivity, making WHO to issue community engagement guidelines for HIV health interventions in communities where the cultural aspect is more important than the scientific one. We have the multi-drug resistant TB trials in South Africa in the 2000s, where researchers still were testing bedaquiline on impoverished. You already understand there's no money. They had no money without full disclosure of all the severe side effects. There's always correction. There's always correction because you are impoverished. Even if you have a home compared to homeless people, you still need money to survive. Beneficence, equity. Equity, why impoverished patients? Why only targeting them? So you see, they were not fully disclosed of all the side effects, and some came with multi-resistant side effects, severe side effects arising from bedaquiline, making their participation not to be voluntary. So you see why we first of all showed all the ethical consideration for you to really correlate what will come here, what will not come if this is done at this particular moment. If you are choosing this particular set of people compared to the others, if you are not fully disclosing, but what you are seeing mostly is informed consent. You see in all these ethical dilemmas, informed consent is the one always coming, minimum 95% of time. Because if someone is fully informed, the person will be fully aware of what awaits him, whether he has money or not to participate. So the aftermath was the South Africa's Medicines Control Council, who tightened informed consent, and the Global TB Alliance. It is the TB Alliance, but since it is worldwide, the global one, they adopted a patient-centric trial type. The patient-centric means that the health of the patient is primordial compared to any other thing. So now in a clinical trial, no matter what you are testing, if at the end the patient will have to suffer from a form of side effect, the trial will have to be reorganized, the methodology, the scientific context of it. That is why you are seeing this patient-centric. When something is patient-centric, can be a patient-centric study, a patient-centric trial. And finally, in Africa, the East Africa Genomic Initiative, still in multiple sub-Saharan African countries, where in different studies, researchers collected DNA samples from thousands of African participants for genomic analysis. So it was crazy, but what was the problem? DNA were exported without local consent or benefit sharing agreement. Exporting without local consent was like form of biopiracy, and data sovereignty was like Africa is not finally having a word in his own from his own people. People outside strangers are coming, taking what you have. And what about the local governance? There is nothing. So the aftermath of it took this high NGO, H3 Africa, to create the ethics working group so as to favorize local governance, and also the creation of the Nagoya Protocol, the adoption of new form of the Nagoya. This Nagoya Protocol is the fair and equity in genetic resources. So if you are doing studies, fairness and equity should be, we should share or we should transport this among ourselves. We have this percentage. So it is mostly for genetic studies, this Nagoya Protocol. And these studies, these multiple studies made to come with benefit sharing agreement. Data sharing agreements, material transfer agreements. We need this agreement when studies are done across multiple countries. So those were the different trials, ethical dilemmas that were done in Africa. And you can see most of them were due to vaccinations. That is why many Africans and Cameroonians, they are afraid of what will come, what will I do? They want to annihilate us. It is because most of the studies, most of the trials that went wrong in Africa are mostly due to vaccinations. They wanted to test new drugs that make people to be there is like vaccine hesitancy. They are afraid of it, and it takes time to really cure things, because you say, but there is not, we didn't see vaccine trial in Cameroon, but we are one. So if it happens elsewhere and a protocol is changed due to something like that, it will be shared among all the different countries. And these are those who were even shown, reported. Imagine that there are other studies that haven't been shown, or it causes consequences like other studies, even if they are not with vaccines, when there is already a particular drug that will be injected with a syringe, it's already a problem, because no, he will be sterilized, he will be affected. It causes difficulties that makes it, with all this aftermath we have seen, still difficult to really maintain a good vaccine prevalence in our African population. Now, in Cameroon, what happened? We have three main trials that were known. First of all, the Finitwine trial. You know you are not a big vaccination company if you have not made errors. After the Trovan in Nigeria, it was Pfizer tested, continued testing in the late 1990s this time. In other countries, Cameroon was just taken for this context. Anti-epilepsy drugs effectiveness, and mostly in rural areas where participants finally suffered liver damage and secondary effects. So you can already understand that improper consent forms and even medical support at the long run. You cannot suffer liver damage. Meanwhile, there is no insurance for you. So that is why clinical trials should always come. If this patient suffer from this, has the laboratory remove funds for the medical follow-up of this particular patient? The improper consent form was, first of all, it was not totally explained, and secondly, not in all the local languages. That is why when submitting protocol to the nationality, it is minimum in 2 languages, minimum. There is no consent form that passes through the nationalities or even regionalities without being in English, and not all, in English and in French. Now, you know the data collectors you are recruiting already. So with the increase of participants who speak different languages, you can now change it, translate it into different languages. So the aftermath is still this, it was the strengthening of the translation of consent forms and community consultation. That is why we have public health, we have epidemiology. Public health will permit you to, when you want to have a study in a rural area or in any other area, the ethical clearance, the administrative, the approval from the different hospitals. If you are going to the community, you discuss with the chief. of the community. You cannot just enter in a community like that. The chief will help you and facilitate your adherence to the population. So you really have the community consultation before entering into a community where you know that they are already vulnerable because their literacy is not as high as those from the urban areas. So you have to explain why you are coming, what has to be done. After that, we had the traditional healers trial in 2002, where traditional healers were like, we found a cure for HIV. It is a herbal HIV remedy plant. So they tested, and it was not even certified, claiming that its curative nature was really healing those with HIV. And unfortunately, the protocol didn't even pass through and its true ethical review. So the ethical violation here were first of all the lies. Is this thing will it really cure? Yes, it will cure you. Them Minsante has already approved. Everything is there. Just doing your thing. Do whatever you want. You are cured from HIV. No safety data shared with communities. So there's nothing you do and you keep it among yourself. And especially no ethical oversight. So the aftermath of this was the strengthening of traditional healers' collaboration with Ministry of Health for research. If you go to the national ethic, there's also a place for traditional healers, traditional practitioners, the amount that they have to pay for their own study, whether observational or clinical trial. You see that they have been integrated not only in collaboration, but also in financial review of their own study, which is there and also and already pasted. So, and lastly, we have the clinical trial on prostitutes. This is one of the clinical trial that may talk about itself and even make question the importance of the national ethics because the national ethics were created before. So how can a big deal come? Meanwhile, you have the approval of the national ethics. So it was a trial on preventive treatment against HIV/AIDS on 400 Douala prostitutes. They are randomized. 200 will be receiving treatment and 200 other placebo. And the placebo was still no medication, no treatment, and if ineffective active principle, just to see if continue doing your thing with your clients. We want to study if finally our preventive treatment. Meanwhile, studies have already shown what are the drugs that are preventive, that are already necessary to prevent HIV. But no, you still separate the population and give to the placebo group non any other. They have ineffective active principle. So the ethical violation was on question medical checkup because when one of the process of the sex workers, since it's now we need to call them not to etiquette a kind of prostitution, it is also their own work, it is a work recognized. They were like, medical checkup is 30,000 if you want to check up for sexually transmitted infection. And but now the NGO came and they said they'll pay everything. They'll pay. Imagine, it means that you are already vulnerable financially because you are happy to participate in a study where someone will come and pay. Imagine the price. It's so much, 30,000 just for a study. You see why for compensation, financial compensation in studies, you should not exceed a certain amount. If it is for transportation, it should be like 3,000. If it is for when you have food, there are some clinical trials where you want to observe the dynamics of a new for when they are eating, you want to observe what is happening, the biosynthesis, pharmacodynamics, and all. They have to stay at the hospital because if they go home, they'll mix it with other. Now they are coming when they were not supposed to come for their medical checkup, and you are still using their time at the hospital. So you can go to 5, 6,000. Imagine you are not going more. If you're already saying that you give 30,000 or you pay, and even for these sex workers, they were just giving 48 condoms every time per month, only 48. So you see how they were just covering their eyes with some kind of promises. It made many of them to be infected with HIV because as soon as they were giving those that inactive, go and do what you want. If the 48 condom finish, use what you have. Use the mean. You are already paying for the medical checkup. So no support to participants who were infected at the long run, non-maleficence, autonomy, and even consent, improper consent, like usual. So it strengthened community advisory boards in Cameroon IRBs for social and sensitive studies. That is why it had to be added again. If IRBs were just for medical and scientific, we now need non-scientific members in the IRB for community, praise other people. Then we also evaluate it in the social aspect. Now, all these studies made global reforms. We have seen the first one, the Nuremberg Code, drafted after World War II of the Nazi experiments, which is a declaration defining the main principles that have become the foundation of research ethics, a document for the foundation of research ethics. We have the Declaration of Helsinki, which emphasizes the importance of protecting vulnerable population. You have seen that even after this declaration, there was one trial where vulnerable were still used, and they had to update this declaration again so that the protection of vulnerable population should be at the highest level and who are not capable of giving voluntary consent. It is in this Declaration of Helsinki that they added legal representative. So because it was not there in the Nuremberg Code, meanwhile it has 11 code, it was not there. So after that, we had the Belmont reports. No matter Nuremberg and Helsinki, they had to give ethical principles to respect. You know that when you know something, you can easily turn around. So they had to block the turnarounds, the ethic, the morals that were going on by identifying three broad ethical principles: respect for individuals, non-maleficence, beneficence, and equity and justice that must be observed when you conduct research involving human subjects. After, we also had the International Ethical Guidelines for Biomedical Research, relates to help developing countries to apply the Declaration of Helsinki and the Nuremberg Code. So, because um, developing countries also have their own difficulties. They also have their own social and cultural context. You have seen the cultural sensitivity that came on. You have to involve the community compared to community involvement was not that in the Nuremberg, Helsinki, Belmont. Meanwhile, our own context is different. It is to we need to have the addition of other forms of protection to the particular individual, and also vulnerability in our own context has different forms. You are not just vulnerable financially. You are vulnerable if you don't have a certain form of literacy. You are vulnerable if you need A, B, C till Z, any kind. And finally, we have the International Council for Harmonization, Good Clinical Practice. It was revived so many times, 1996. The idea came in 1995, but it was revived, it was adopted in 1996. Another revision was made in 2016, in 2023. And if you type, you'll see the updated one in January 2025. So we are discussing like that, and we have an updated version of the International Council where all these trials regarding drugs, pharmaceutical products, and were harmonized. So if a trial is done in Cameroon, it should have the same standards as done in France or in the USA, adding our own international ethical guidelines and national guidelines to it, so that the results should be harmonized. You should have a trial where if your results are positive here, it should be adopted worldwide, and not like the other one where they had to create again a trial where the placebo group had nothing, and some were using zidovudine already. So you will need a trial where the results are harmonized to many particular contexts, socio-economical contexts, and to ensure a high level of quality and safety for both the end user and the participant. What are the key lessons here? You can see that this place is always almost out, but it's the most important. The respect of individual right and well-being is a must. It's a must. This must is not in capital letters as an error. It is like that. It must be respected. Right and well-being. Proper informed consent should serve as a cornerstone always, always. Some ethics committee already gave them the template for you to fill. We will see everything in the other presentations. Participation and withdrawal should have no consequences. So if you don't participate, you will be subjected to. If you don't, especially for we can take the case of prisoners. By participating in our study, you reduce the number of years here because you help science. No, you should not promise something. You participate. The benefit should be scientific. You should not coerce someone according to what the person needs. If not, they are already vulnerable. We should amplify African ethical leadership and IRB strengthening. That is why we will see it again in our presentation, where you can see that it is already there. We have the H3A Africa working group that is coming. We have the community engagement that are adding itself. We have the social aspect adding in our IRBs. Those are that is what is starting. We have even the increase of regional and institutional IRBs. Scientific curiosity shouldn't be above human health. You should provide measures to mitigate even the lowest risk. All our protocols, all they have the aspect on ethical consideration. Your study is just observational. We don't have a risk. There is always a risk. Even the risk is 0.001. And now, since there's the possibility of having that risk and you have accepted it, how will you correct? How will you mitigate? How will you reduce the risk? Either in the form of confidentiality, when you're injecting any kind, you should give a table, you should put a table, or just in a small phrase, how will you do it? And finally, protecting a vulnerable population at all costs. Poverty, even language barrier, and that is why we had the increase of the Helsinki, where we have the legal representative that will come into place, and even the third party, so that the person should better explain. So, and even sign, not just explain, but sign, put your name, put your information that you have explained, you were there when this person consented to participate in the study. So those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. That is why our first presentation in ethics is regarding the past, so that we should not repeat all the different errors. These cases highlighted the urgent need for strong ethical frameworks and application in our context to reduce ethical violation. The ethical violations are according to ethical considerations, particularly to low income and marginalized population. Those marginalized population are the vulnerable populations. We have learned from the past in this presentation to apply more emphasis on ethical consideration. That is why the first slide after the purpose of this study, of our presentation, were what are ethical considerations? What are these guidelines that made us to understand what should be respected? So you have already seen it, and we have seen that the Belmont reports ethical consideration were there, and that ethical principles are not just guidelines, but non-negotiable standards in research. You have seen all these errors. There's no more, I made it without, no. You already remember, you already know the past. These presentations were made. The presentation will not be copied, will not be hidden. It is found in internet, everything you have read about it. You should not repeat again the same error just because you wanted to do your study fast, or you wanted to. That is why there will be a series of other presentations on how you have to interact with the ethics committee so as not to repeat some particular errors, so that you respect all the ethical considerations made in your study. So these were the references, and thank you for your keen attention.